All right, here we are with part two of week 9. Welcome, Joseph. Welcome, friends in the live stream. Welcome, everyone who is watching this recording. I'm so happy you decided to join me for part two of this conversation. On Tuesday night, we got started with our study of the term porneia, which often gets translated in English Bibles as either fornication or as sexual immorality. And we'll do a quick review of what we covered on Tuesday night just to catch up with, well, why it may or may not mean either of those things, and some of the things that we found out based on two of the terms that show up in the New Testament, porne and pornos. That was where we left off, and I realized we have at least another hour's worth of scripture passages to look through before we come to any kind of conclusion about what porneia might generally be indicating. And what we've seen already is that the way the New Testament treated the word porne is in fact different than the way it treats the word pornos, which is a male prostitute instead of a female prostitute. Two different kinds of things. And again, if we can let go of this idea of prostitution for a moment, drop back into the original meaning of the term, which is commercial, one who is engaging in a trade or some kind of financial exchange. That is the kind of, because remember what we're looking at is not just a sexual relationship, but a sexual relationship with a particular meaning. And the meaning that is given to a sexual relationship from porne and from pornos is a financial and economic meaning. This is the root of the term. We saw a little bit about how porne is separated from the overall idea of prostitution, which is never treated in a positive light. However, prostitute itself, the person to whom that term is applied, is often, in fact, treated in a better light in the New Testament than we might have expected. The other thing that I want to remind us of, and I thought this was so interesting going through my study, is that pornos is not somebody who purchases prostitution. It is somebody who offers sexual services for a price, but pornos is the male variant. And this is a thing that is never it's never come up so far in my studies of the conversation about homosexuality. And I think it's incredibly significant because a lot of the purchasers of prostitution were male, and the pornos carries the implicit assumption similar to what we saw in our study of Malakos and of the eunuchs, a way that defies this honor shame dynamic that is the social order the New Testament is being written in. So, a couple things I want to bring us to just as a review of part one. First of all, how did we get to this idea that porneia, as it is in the New Testament, means sex outside of marriage? Well, there's a fairly easy path to trace if you look at it. The first video I did trace this to the King James Version, which was informed by the Latin translation written by Jerome. I think it was around the year 400 or 500. And the Latin translation used the term fornicatio for translating the term porneia. Now, we understand a little bit about what porneia means, and in that time, the Latin term fornicatio had a reasonably similar meaning to porneia, the sale of sexual services. And if you look at it today, there's a lot of churches that are covered in fornications because that word has come down to us from the Latin, meaning they're like little cornices. I think they're like arch points that you see in church buildings and other kinds of grand architecture. These are called fornication. Blue is saying, welcome back, Blue, by the way. Bastardy laws probably had something to do with it. In fact, the thing that most informed perhaps Jerome's translation, as well as the understanding of the early church fathers on this topic, was not Jesus, was not Paul. But if you're interested, I'm actually going to show you this book. I realized I have it with me today, but The Making of Fornication by Kathy Gaka, an incredible study of the context of where we get this term and how it came to mean what it means today, or what it meant a lot of times in the early church literature. She traces it, in fact, not to Jesus, not to Paul, but to Pythagoras, which is completely unexpected and a surprise. But if you take a look at that book and really want to dive into the roots of how we got the meaning sex outside of marriage, it traces its way back to Greek philosophy, which is evolving alongside of this term. Because if you remember again, Pythagoras was just barely a couple hundred years previous to the use of the term porneia in the writing of the Septuagint. So these things are around the same time period. So we have this evolving conversation in Greco-Roman culture with the newly emerging Christianity, and this eventually makes its way into our modern understanding of, well, porneia must have meant sex outside of marriage. The thing is, the people who have studied this term have not spent enough time looking at the Septuagint, which is the primary source of our understanding what this term means, because the term porneia doesn't actually appear in all of this other literature. It eventually, around 300 to 400 years after Christ, after these writings of Paul, in fact, gets attached to the notion of sex outside of marriage. So if you were curious about how we got to this meaning of porneia as fornication, premarital sex, sex outside of marriage, that is the clear line of philosophical history. Christianity informed by culture, which kind of was a surprise to me to read that, but it was very interesting. The second way that it now gets translated is sexual immorality. And we looked last time at the list of potentially illicit sexual activities in the time when the Bible was being written. And the list of acceptable activities that they had was quite a bit different than the list of sexual activities that we have today, or that you might have heard about in your church. So whose list do we go with? Does it simply mean a vague whatever is illicit? In that case, culture becomes the deciding point of what sexual morality is. Now, I'm not going to leave us there, because we looked at the honor-shame dynamic and what that's communicating to us. We recognized that maybe the honor-shame dynamic is not necessarily what Christians are called to. That's a piece that I want to study a little bit further and continue this conversation as I begin to study the early church fathers and some more of this literature beyond the New Testament. However, let's think about this for a minute. The honor-shame dynamic only applied to males in the society who had social economic status. Certain kinds of sexual behaviors could lower your status. Love this, what's going on in the chat. Gnosticism, Christian beliefs seem to have been influenced by Greek philosophy quite a lot more than you might expect, actually. Platonism and Gnostic philosophy, though Gnostic philosophy being deeply misunderstood, did create this separation of the body from the spirit. We talked about that quite a bit more, I think, in week 6 and week 7. So the honor-shame dynamic exists, and it's particularly attached to this notion of trading versus the craftsman. The merchants in this time period were not respectable people. The craftsmen, the creators, were the people who were respectable. The honor-shame dynamic is in fact already attached to this idea of porneia, somebody who trades in sexual services. That is of itself dishonorable because it is attached to trading. Now, today, we don't have that same kind of view of merchants and traders. We tend to look up to merchants and traders and think they're incredible people. Fortunately, I studied marketing, just as a confession. The other piece that we need to look at is the definition of the word sin literally means to miss the mark. So if you were a high status individual, you would miss the mark in a different way than somebody who had no status. For example, as a high status male, it was your job to be the dominant penetrating partner in a sexual relationship. If you were not that high status male, you had nothing to lose by being penetrated, by being on the submissive or on the getting fucked end of the scale. And we looked at how that language has even made its way into English, where you have this dominance and violence that is taking place surrounding our conversation of sexuality. So even though I talk about the honor-shame dynamic as something I would like to dismiss, it is still deeply present in our world today. And I'll be talking more about that also in the future. Let's see. We have 8 uses of this term in the Hebrew text from the same time period as the Septuagint. The majority of the times we see this word are from the Septuagint, and One of the things that makes it difficult for modern readers to understand the use of this term in the Septuagint is that we don't believe there is more than one God. Especially if you come from a Christian background, you're like, there is one God, and there's a lot of pretend things that people think are gods, but they're not actually gods. When you go back into the Hebrew scriptures, however, we get a different picture. And when you get to the Ten Commandments and there's thou shalt have no other gods before me, it is referring to literal other gods. In Christianity, that notion comes to us a little bit in the idea of things like thrones and principalities and powers, but we don't think of it in terms of other gods that are actual, real, living, active forces and dynamics in the world. This is how the Hebrew scriptures thought of this. And so for an individual who was part of a culture, your body belonged to that God. The things that you did were in worship and service of that God. And this is partly why we see so much of a call for separation throughout the first 5 books. We have this call for being different. There's so much of a there are many instances we see where intercultural marriage is prohibited. Why? Because it meant being joined to another God, and you were supposed to belong to only one God. You could be joined to by a number of different things. You could be joined to by going to a sacrifice and worship. You could be joined to by eating with those people. You could be joined to through marriage, and you could be joined to through participation in sex rituals, which recent scholarship has started to question whether those were actually as prevalent as a lot of people like to think. So the word porneia is used for all of these instances because in the Septuagint, what that term is attempting to communicate is that the people of God are letting themselves be sold to or belong to whoever's going to, whichever God is going to provide the food, whichever God is going to bring the rain, you can have my service. So when I have sex, I will do it in worship of this God. Or when I have sex, I'll do it in worship of, maybe it's the rain God or the wheat God or the giving me lots of children God. And what porneia is used to do is to call these people away from using their sexuality in service of other gods and toward their sexuality being used only in service of one God, as with every part of life. Because sex, again, in this time period, is not quite so disconnected from every other part of life as it often seems to be today. We're going to see this over and over again in the terms that we look at tonight, which is why I paused here to review this meaning in the Septuagint. Now, if you want to see more of the research on this, I will again I'll direct you to the research of Kathy Gaka, as well as I think Kyle Harper touches on this a little bit. Those are 2 of the leading researchers on this term. Let's see. We've already reviewed porne and pornos. And so let us move into, this is going to be fun. Let's move into our next term, which is pornuo. Pornuo is a term that is derived from porne and pornos, and this is a verb. It means to do the porne thing, to do the pornos thing. It's the active engagement in whatever this is. Potentially, we can think of it as the sale of intimacy. And I like this idea of the sale of intimacy in conversation with what we find out in the Septuagint, because intimacy has to do with this deep vulnerability, this connection, less so to do with a particular kind of engagement of certain body parts. And this, again, is what this term is calling us to, is what are we going to serve? What are we going to be joined to? Quite interesting. And it's surprised me, in fact, somewhat the link between joined to that we saw at the very beginning of this study and that is coming back in again now here at the end. Let's see. We have a couple of things that we'll see, and I just want to point this out right up front, is that in Revelation, as well as in the prophets, Revelation is the book that most closely imitates the prophets in its use of this term. Let me get my screen set up and I will share the screen with you. In the book of Revelation, the term pornuo is explicitly connected with merchants, with commerce, with trading. And we also see, I'm trying to multitask, this isn't working very well. We also see in the Septuagint. The translation is relationship between idolatry, infidelity, political and economic alliances, and in short, the term often meant to porneuo yourself in the Septuagint, meant to become an ally or a trading partner of another nation that you weren't supposed to. This other nation now had power. They were now potentially the dominant partner here. Who is supposed to be the dominant partner, especially once the Old Testament language starts to change toward marriage? In the book of Hosea, around that time period, the imagery of marriage started to be used to explain the relationship between God and the nation of Israel. That's when we start to get terms like adultery, playing the prostitute. And now we're using these cultural expectations surrounding marital relationships and using them to try to communicate something about God and his relationship to the people of Israel. I'm going to take a look at this comment before we start looking at these verses here. Calvinism is full of it. Catholicism seems to have co-opted a lot of Roman cultural values, which is influenced by Greek ones. In a lot of ways, yes. When we look at, I think we talked about this in terms of incest, as well as the Greek practice of sex between boys and men. The Romans kind of looked down on that as opposed to fully embracing it, but Rome did adopt so much of the Greek culture as well as the Greek language here. And given that the center of the Catholic Church stayed in Rome, no wonder there was a lot of crossover in relationship. So you're probably seeing my screen here. Porneuo, this term we're looking at from porne, and we'll just take a look at a couple of the verses. There's not a lot of them that show up. Looks like we have 8 examples. The very first one may be the most famous one of all. And if you have ever been a male in a Christian youth group context, you have heard this before. Flee fornication. Guess what? That first word is actually not porneuo. That first word is porneia, which we're going to look at next. Porneuo comes in here. The one who actively does this thing sins against his own body. Let me go back to my notes. I had a quick reset over here. I have so many notes. What I want us to look at here, every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the one who porneuo sins against his own body misses the mark relative to what standard? Is it a social standard? Is it a legal standard? What I find very interesting here, and you'll see this in other research on this topic, that porneuo, what this is a sin against one's own body. And the word for body here is soma, which is referring quite literally to the flesh and blood. There's something against a sin against that. Now, because of what our conversation was last time about 1 Corinthians 5 and 6, is it speaking of the body? Because 6:19, this term for body is going to be plural. So is the sin against the body his own body, meaning this is a sin against his own church community, his own community of believers? Potentially. And what I'm going to see tonight, I think, is a lot of double meaning, where we have both the individual meaning as well as the corporate meaning attached to porneuo. And here what we have, if you are selling yourself out to another god, if you are living your life in service of another god, not only is it harmful for you, it is potentially harmful for the rest of your community, especially when we think back, and Paul is referring to people who understand the honor-shame dynamic. If somebody in your community is committing something shameful or worshiping another god, that is calling the integrity of your whole community, your whole body, which is in fact how this term soma gets used, the whole group of you are being called into question. So perhaps what Paul is saying here is that porneia is not just a sin against oneself, it is a sin against the whole community. On the other hand, another way to read this, because again, there's multiple ways to read this, soma doesn't always mean group of people. It could mean sin against the physical body, missing the mark of the physical body. What would that indicate? I'm intrigued by what that indicates, because we've talked a lot about what does it mean to honor the body. And if you remember, to trade, to exchange, is a dishonorable practice in this culture. And so to make your body of lower status is to use it, to exchange it for the sake of getting something else, be that money, be that influence, be that a happier relationship. Whatever you're exchanging it for is potentially missing the mark of the honor that belongs to the body. When you are doing something you do not want to be doing, but you are using the body as an object of exchange, this is missing the mark of what it's called to be. That's another way of reading this. And I hope you get this idea that there are a lot of potentially good ways to interpret these passages, and there are some really unfortunate ways. If we come in and we assume that porneia means fornication, we're like, well, fornication is terrible because it's a sin against the body. We don't actually know why. We just know that it's a bad thing. And this is why I wanted to go all the way into these terms and seek to understand the context that gives them to us before we try to decide what they mean and impose our own time understanding on them. The other thing I want to look at here, yeah, let's look at it. So 1 Corinthians 6:18 has a parallel. Flee fornication has its own parallel in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And so if you're following along in a Bible, I'm going to open another tab here. And we're going to take a look at 1 Corinthians 10, because when we're thinking about an author and what the author wants to communicate, if they use the same phrasing twice, one might suspect we can learn something from the way they use both of them. So let's see, what have I got here? I've got new tab. I think this is it. All right, Blue Letter Bible, and we'll go to 1 Corinthians 10, where we're going to get our parallel to this term. Let's see. I wish I had written down where it is. Last time I came looking for this, I couldn't find it for a couple of minutes. You cannot do this. Okay, look at this. Verse 21, we're going to just detour for a minute. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You cannot be partakers in the Lord's table and the table of devils. Remember how we talked about how eating together was a way of being joined to? This again is calling for this idea of separation. Do we provoke the Lord? All things are lawful for me. Do you remember this? If you know 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul cited the exact same thing in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. So what we should be seeing here is that there's a lot of parallel taking place between 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Corinthians 10. And by the way, I found it. 10:14. Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee idolatry. You flee from porneia and flee from, what is this term? Let's take a look. Idolatreas. Kind of makes it's easy to read this one. Both of these two things have a very similar meaning. Idolatry would be to just go to another god, where porneia would be to exchange with the other god. What is this god going to give me if I worship this god? So what is Paul talking about in chapter 10? We're going to scroll up a little bit because our very next verse on this list, let's go back to our list of porneuo, is in fact in 1 Corinthians 10. It's 1 Corinthians 10:8. Neither let us commit fornication, porneuo, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. And then he starts talking about Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel to do two things. Okay, this here is, jump to the book of Revelation. But it's relevant. Here's why. Look what he's talking about here in chapter 10. And you can see my screen, I believe. Good. Neither be idolaters as some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. This term for play in the Hebrew is one of those euphemisms for foreplay. We could potentially think of it that way. 10:8. Neither let us commit porneuo, as some of them committed and fell in one day, 23,000. When did 23,000 people fall in one day? Paul is referring here to something that happens in Numbers chapter 25. And notice this word whoredom. This is probably going to be translated in the Septuagint with the word porneia. Let's see. Ek pornusai. Wow. They in fact use the stronger than porneuo. It is the ek porneuo. That is like as bad as it gets. So here in Numbers 25, we have something going on, and this is where, let me see if I can find the numbers. Let's see. The number of people that were killed in the plague is written in here somewhere, 20 and 4,000. Now there's some scholarly conversation around this, because some people refer to this as 23,000 and some as 24. There's like a special 1,000 something that's taking place in the Jewish conversation around this time. So when Paul says 23,000 were killed in one day, he's referring still to this were 24,000. And this is also, again, what happened with the daughters of Moab. What is the problem? This is the males whose bodies belong to Christ are going to females whose bodies belong to a different God. Look what happens. They called the people to sacrifices of their gods. What did they do to commit porneia? They did eat and bow down to their gods. I don't see premarital sex anywhere in here. I don't see an issue of extramarital sex in here. I don't see homosexuality in here. I don't see any of the things that people typically think of porneia, pορνευω as in this passage. This passage should be a very clear indication. What is πορνευω? It is eating and bowing down to their gods. Now, bowing down can also be a euphemism for a sexual practice of worship. It may or may not be that. Again, this is something that is presently being debated in scholarship at the moment as to whether or not that was in fact a prevalent practice. So what is going on? We have a link here between Numbers 25, 1 Corinthians 10, and 1 Corinthians 6:18. What are we supposed to flee? This is the question. Because when I heard what we were supposed to flee, I always heard sexual desire. Nobody ever told me, flee from doing things with your body that are in service of anything other than God. I wish I had heard that. That would have been so helpful. That would have been so cool. It would have given me something to pursue, to flee from intentionally doing this thing that is going to identify me with being against God, that is intentionally going to cause harm to my Christian community. By all means, now I know what to run away from. I can actually see when it's there. And by the way, this is no longer telling me to run away from something that God made, which is sexual desire, which is the human body, which is sex itself. These are things of God's creation. And when we read flee fornication without understanding its context, its reference points, and its uses in the scripture, we're going to end up fighting against things that God designed for our own benefit, and probably failing in the process, experiencing a lot of shame, and maybe even at some point doing things that we might regret. This is part of why it's so important to me that we let the scripture itself help us define what these terms might potentially mean. We have again this relationship now, Revelation 2:14. Let's look at this. This is a reference back to the exact same story in the book of Numbers. I have a few things against you because you've taught them who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel. Sorry about that movement there. To do what? To eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit fornication. These two things are linked together all the time. Do you remember when we looked at those passages in Acts 15? We might actually have saved that for tonight. If you looked it up, you saw the relationship between eating food and porneia, these two things. And in fact, in the Septuagint passages, the connection between gluttony and porneia, that one is another interesting thing. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and in 10, Paul is talking about the body and what is the purpose of the body. We'll see that a little bit more once we open the actual term porneia. My goodness, yes, this comment we have in the chat is so good. I need to read it out loud. People really don't even stop to think about the fact they believe a biological drive designed by God is evil. Oh my goodness, yes. This is what it brings us to. When we let ourselves be lazy in our interpretation and we're like, well, this is what my church thinks, this is what I heard growing up, until we actually go and look into this, we're probably going to think, yeah, this just wait until you get married to have sex and you won't be committing fornication. Actually, not really, because this here, if we are I'm jumping to my conclusion in some ways, but if we are expressing our sexuality in ways that do not align with our identity as followers of Christ, this is what the term is calling us to recognize. That takes place whether we are married or not. If our sexual expression is in service of compulsive desire, if it is in service of power, if it is in service of anything other than love and the fruits of the Spirit, this sexual expression fits under the category of porneia. Marital status does not erase this calling for the Christian. This is why I think what we're talking about here is perhaps even more beautiful, perhaps even more inspiring, perhaps even more difficult to achieve. Because who is it that always expresses love in everything that they do? Who is it that is never driven by their appetite to eat food that's not healthy for them? Like, these are things that happen. But once we reframe this conversation and realize porneia is telling us about something to pursue, rather than just something, wait until you get married. Try not to have sexual desires over people you're not married to. Try not to do the bad sexual thing, whatever you think that might be. And now this is saying, no, what is your sexual expression in service of? What do you see in your sexual expression? What would others see in your sexual expression? Is it something that is beautiful? Is it something that reflects the image of God or not? If not, run away from that. That's not going to be good for you. It's a sin, A, against your own body, and B, against the body of people that you're connected to. Quite an interesting shift in conversation. So Revelation 2, exact same thing going on here. Again, Revelation 2:20, this is similar, but again, we have servants to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed to idols. These two pieces come together. Why? Because porneia means being joined to another god, and a way that you did that was by eating the things that belonged to that other god. That other god is now providing you your food. Remember this idea of the exchange? Whichever god gives me food, whichever god gives me money, that's the one that my body belongs to now. This is where this porneia concept comes in. It's an exchange. Your body is now objectified. Your body is now the medium of exchange. Your life is given to whoever is going to provide for you. And just a short personal reflection. Over the past couple of years, I've been wrestling with how much I have treated my own relationship with God in that way. I'm going to do this for you so that you do this for me. I'm going to wait to have sex till I get married, so you give me an amazing sex life after I'm married. It's an exchange. It is doing the exact same thing that's being described here. Revelation 17:2, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. Let's see. I missed so many of my notes. Okay. Before we get to that, we need to talk about something that Kathy Gaka, again, also talks about, and that is the use of the term porneia. So here in Revelation chapter 2, we have an author who is trying to discredit certain religious teachers by saying that they are committing porneia. This may be the same thing that's happening in 1 Corinthians 5 when Paul's talking about somebody who is committing incest. In other words, having his father's wife. But why does Paul use the term porneia? He's attempting to discredit the person by saying they have no self-control. They have no ability to live their life in a way that is respectable. They're dishonorable. There's no way you all should be celebrating them. What are you doing? Don't be joined to them. Disconnect from them. Don't even eat with that person. I'm kind of paraphrasing 1 Corinthians 5 here. This is how porneia gets to be used by these later days of in the books, when the later books of the New Testament are being written, and we're starting to get into conversation of early church fathers, and especially when we get to some of the heresiologies. This term porneia is used to say, oh, this person has no theological credibility because they commit porneia. So porneia becomes a thing that you use to discredit anybody. I think we still have something similar today when we have people who don't live up to their sexual standards. Usually you have so many Christian leaders who are committing sexual violence, and I in fact blame that on their lack of understanding of what this passage is and never learning how to express their sexuality in service of God, and only letting it be an expression of service to their lust, whether that was in marriage or outside of marriage. or letting sexuality be in service of anything other than the Holy Spirit. This is what Porneia is calling us to, but if we miss that and we're like, oh, I didn't commit fornication because I got married first, now we're running into all kinds of problems. So we still have something similar going on today to what we see in Revelation chapter 2, where authors will use sexual behavior to discredit the person. And I think people actually use this on me as well, most likely, because I'm not teaching wait until you get married to have sex. They're like, well, how can this person be even reading the Bible? Because obviously the Bible says don't have sex before marriage. Somewhere. I would like anyone to show me where it actually says that about men, by the way. It does say that about girls who belong to their fathers and whose fathers will lose a lot of money if they do it. What is sexual misconduct? That is the question. So if porneia is just illicit sexual behavior, yeah. All right, I'm gonna keep moving on. Revelation 17:2. With whom the kings of the earth have done what? Eaten food, most likely, and bowed down to other gods. Or the kings of the earth, were these kings supposed, this is really interesting, right? The kings of the earth are the ones who are committing porneuo here. They are selling themselves to something. They're selling themselves for some kind of exchange. Similar thing here, Revelation chapter 18, the kings of the earth. Who is it that is committing porneuo in these examples? Kings of the earth. What do the kings represent? Again, this is economic and political alliances. Same thing that we're referring to back in the Septuagint. We have the echoes of it in the word porneuo here in the book of Revelation. Notice this, the merchants of the earth, those who trade and sell, are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. The kings of the earth who have committed fornication, who have done porneuo and lived deliciously. Again, this is about wealth and economic prosperity. So we have this connection. I hope we still see this between porneuo connected to idolatry and connected to economics. Who is it that you are exchanging yourself to? Now, the kings of the earth, like, this is just fascinating me right now because I haven't seen this before. The kings of the earth are not the reason why she's committing fornication. It's not saying she is committing fornication with the kings of the earth. Why is it that the kings of the earth are going to her? And now this is, oh my goodness, so intriguing. When you look at the current scholarship on the prostitute in Revelation, Gaka's book includes some of this, and you can see this in other places as well. But the prostitute in all of the prophetic scriptures is representing the people of God. You have the nations. I'm imagining this in medieval Western European history. The nations are going to the Pope to crown the king. They are committing fornication with her. That is such a weird concept to me. It makes a lot of logical sense, but I have never thought of it. I'm gonna have to keep pondering that one for a little bit. But why is it that it is the other people who are doing this and not her? I always thought the problem was that, you know, she was the one who was selling herself to all these people, but that's not what these passages are saying. The kings of the earth are the ones who are doing it. Anyway, we can leave that there. Let's just recognize again, this is about trading, trafficking, economic exchange, again, about power dynamics. And as we saw earlier, the uses of pornea instructions in 1 Corinthians are referring back to the book of Numbers, which in Numbers, what are we doing? We're bowing down to other gods. We're eating with foreigners. And the other thing that's happening there, we'll need to know this as we look at porneia. The other thing that is happening in the book of Numbers, just take a look. Phinehas, the son of, no, not this one of the children of Israel came, brought to his family a woman. You don't bring a woman to your family because you're going to have sex with her. You bring a woman to your family because you are going to marry her. This is what's going on. And by the way, especially if this woman is a princess, who she was, and if the guy is an important member of not the priestly family, but he's one of the leading families in Israel, and he finds a princess who wants to marry him. How awesome, right? This is going to be a love story straight out of Disney. But no, because her body, her life belongs to this other god. and him marrying her would be joining himself to that other god during the height of the wedding celebration, which, if you know anything about these Jewish wedding ceremonies, the height of it is this sexual coming together. Eliezer breaks in, murders both of them. Specifically, we get this described what happens. He pierces the woman right through her womb, is what happens. And is described in detail for us because this was the troubling point. You cannot be joined to another god. At least this is what's happening in the book of Numbers. I believe it's in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where Paul starts to analyze this a little bit more. And he's like, well, you know, if you're married to somebody who is, they technically belong to another god and you have children together, maybe it's okay to stay together. Maybe you don't have to divorce them because technically you're committing porneia by being joined to that person. Remember, don't be joined to the porne. This is part of what's embedded in that saying. Don't be joined to this person who belongs to another god. But if you're married, you're about as joined to as you can get to another person, then stay together, because maybe you are actually the one who's going to save your partner, or maybe your children are going to be sanctified or made holy or set apart now to God because they're your children. And by the way, as we saw in the story of Jesus with this notion of being defiled or clean and unclean, it is when the clean thing touches the unclean thing that now the unclean is restored. In the Old Testament, we have the inversion. If you are clean and you touch something unclean, you are now contaminated. Jesus gives us this reversal, which is, I think, just one of the most beautiful parts of the gospel message. You kind of have a similar reversal then in 1 Corinthians 7. And I'm sorry, we didn't look at that. If you want to open that up in your Bibles, I think it's later on here, something about the husband sanctified by the wife, the unbelieving wife sanctified by the husband. Paul is still having in mind this notion of who are you marrying? Are you being joined to someone who belongs to God or not? Again, you've heard the unequally yoked passage. This is what it's talking about. Who does the body belong to? And when you go to the temple of that God, you were saying, oh, well, this God is the one that is blessing me, therefore it's my God. Or this other God is the one that's blessing me, therefore it's my God. He's saying this is what Porneia is calling us. Don't be this way. You already belong to one God. This is what we get at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 6. You are bought with a price. If we're thinking wedding language, marriage language, slave language, all of these things they're very similar. The difference between a slave and a woman in this honor shame discussion is minute. Amazing. Thanks for the message. Welcome, Caleb. For you are bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in what? Your body and in your spirit. And I think, again, these are these? I'm not sure if these are singular or plurals. I really need to touch up on my Greek. I'm going back into New Testament class here in a couple of weeks. Okay. More time for that later. For now, we just need to finish this look at porneuo. And we saw this term ek porneuo come to us in the book of Numbers. So this word whoredom, ek porneuo, when we look at that in the New Testament, we have only one example of it, and it's given to us in Jude chapter 1. Oh, interesting. I was doing some research over there. Let's go straight to Jude. The book of Jude, 1:7. I think there's only one chapter, so it's all Jude 1. All right, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. We studied this a little bit in week 8. Giving themselves over to fornication. This is how the King James is translating ek porneuo. What the literal meaning is something coming out of that. Whatever this is has its roots in porneuo. So you thought porneuo was bad with its roots in trading. Ek porneuo is even worse. But what is happening here? We have them giving themselves over to porneuo, and what are they doing? What does this mean? What is worse than porneuo? Going after heteros. We looked at this, different flesh. This idea of the interspecies sexuality. Because again, if you've never looked at this before, Jude makes reference to the book of Enoch, and Enoch refers to angels and humans having sex together. And so when we have this story of angels going into the city of Sodom and the men seeking to rape the angels, they were going after strange flesh. They weren't going after other male bodies. This isn't about homosexuality. This is about going beyond the boundaries of ek porneuo. This is terrible. Let's see. They're set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. This is what happens in ek porneuo, completely selling yourself over to something. Let's not do that. Now, before you accept my conclusion that I just said, I want you to look at something. Do you see this comma right here at the end of the word fornication? At the end of the word ek porneuo, there's a comma. So are we talking about two different things? Giving themselves over to ek porneuo and doing this other thing, going after strange flesh. And just so you know, there are whole academic papers written about this comma. Because if going after strange flesh is the author's way of elaborating this is what ek porneuo is, that helps us read the verse in one way. If they are doing ek porneuo and going after strange flesh, now we have to read this term ek porneuo in a slightly different way because the author has no longer told us exactly what he means by that word. So what is the correct Greek way to read this? Well, I'm sad to inform you that both ways are potentially correct. So how do we come to our potential conclusions here? So I've given you one way of reading this, potentially a couple ways of reading this, but if we're looking at this, giving themselves over to fornication, this term ek porneuo is also used here. So it could mean that what they're doing is they're eating and bowing down to other gods. Why would this be a problem for the people of Sodom? Were they supposed to be people who were worshiping God, but instead they were not? And then in addition to that, they were also going after strange flesh. That's what happens if we read that comma differently. And so now you know what a difference a comma makes and why it has taken me so long to actually study these things. Why it's just so interesting to go into this. What I want to encourage us in though, when I first started looking at all of these Greek words, when I first made my collection of English words referring to sexuality in the Bible, I felt overwhelmed. And if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by what I'm saying about this thing of the comma, I want to offer this encouragement that God can speak through anything, whether that is through your own life experience, whether that's through a video like this, whether that's through reading your Bible and just looking at the word fornication and being like, there's something here that I want to avoid. There's something here that God speaks about. God cares about something to do with sex, something to do, at least this is what I understand, something to do with the sale, something to do with trading. And maybe you don't even have to understand what's going on in the Greek or care about where the comma is. Maybe what's important is that we listen and let God speak and keep ourselves in a place of question and a place of repentance and a place of openness and saying yes. Because even me today, let's imagine I started my study like over a decade ago now. What if I had stopped with the first thing I found? As you saw, I'm still finding new things, even as we're going through this Bible study live. I am still growing and changing. I think this is part of the Christian journey because if God is infinite, there is no way that any one of us gets to comprehend the whole story up front. This is why Paul says something like this. He's like, love builds up, knowledge puffs up. If any one of you think he knows anything, he knows nothing at all. And so the point that I really want to make here is that God can speak to us through the text, whether or not we've done this whole study. But let's not start to pretend that the way God has spoken to me through the text and the way God has spoken to you through the text are the same. Sometimes God might say something different to one person than he says to another. And when it comes to this idea of sex in service of, in worship of God, that may look different for me than it might look for you. It may look different for every one of us. It probably does. It's based on our past experience, based on our present circumstances. What does love look like today? Might be a really important question for us to ask. And to then trust that we are being led by the Spirit throughout our journey. Whether or not we have gotten to the bottom of it, which we haven't, right? If you've been here with me, you've now been here with me for almost 2 hours, maybe almost 3 hours studying this word, we still haven't got to the bottom of it. We still have not concluded that this is exactly what the word means. We have looked at what it means in a majority of cases. We have looked at how it means something very different than what a lot of people teach and what a lot of people expect. But I will say, I know less about what this word means today than I felt like I knew when I thought it meant premarital sex. It's just, it's wild. The less you know, the more you think you know. So when somebody's going to tell you exactly what the Bible says, again, this might mean they haven't stopped long enough to let the Bible say anything. They might be putting their own words, their own understanding into the Bible's mouth. So let's move on to our final term, which is the title of this video, porneia. Oh my goodness, this is going to be fascinating. We've already seen that porneia is a sin against the body, whatever porneia happens to be. Now, the way that we want to view this final term, porneia is a noun. It's referring to something. So, for example, I think maybe Google is a good word for this. So Google is a thing. This is the porne or the pornos in this case. Sorry, Google, if you're listening. So Google is the noun. And when you are going to Google something, you are using that noun. You are participating in that noun. What does the noun mean? Searching. So Googling means the active verb of searching for something. Now, when we want to talk about this idea of search altogether, internet search or Google altogether, we're going to have another noun that refers to all of those activities, that kind of thing. So when I talk about to Google something, you may not be going to do that. Eisegesis, yes, what a word. So I don't know, that was probably a bad comparison, but I'm trying to look at where porneia comes in relative to these other terms. And it is not the origin word, but it is a word to describe what happens when people are doing the verb. So let's take a look at our very first one. And before we do, I want you to keep the Septuagint in mind. The Septuagint is the primary book that gets referenced, and this is very interesting, by the authors of the New Testament. They primarily reference the Septuagint, not the Hebrew scriptures. They reference the Greek translations of the Hebrew scriptures. When you get direct quotes from Jesus, it's coming from the Septuagint. It's quite interesting. So let's pull up the word porneia. And let's see, I'm still sharing the tab. And see what our first appearance of the term is. It is in Matthew 5:32. I do have whole videos on this question because Matthew 5:32, Matthew 19 are both speaking about this idea of marriage and divorce. So if you missed the marriage and divorce conversation, I suggest go back and take a look at that. And if you want to, I do have YouTube videos specifically dedicated to this conversation and what potentially porneia means in this context of Jesus' conversation. I think I have like 4 different variations of this that I offer. So interesting. Yes, understanding this can lead to closer connection with God, and not understanding it can lead to disconnection with God. This is why what we're doing, I think, is so important. So thank you all for being here with me. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, whoever shall put away his wife, except for the cause of fornication. Now, if fornication meant extramarital sex, that gives a particular meaning to this verse, doesn't it? Only issue is that extramarital sex for a wife explicitly means adultery. If he wanted to say the woman had extramarital sex, he didn't need to use the word fornication. He would have just said, if the wife commits adultery, the husband no longer is causing her to commit adultery. She chose to do it all of her own. But that's not what's saying. Whoever puts away his wife, except for the cause of porneia. If we look at what happens in the Old Testament and all of the prohibitions, there are so many of them against marrying a woman who belongs to another god. I believe it's Matthew chapter 5. Let me open this up. No, it's not Matthew 5. It's the the Matthew 19. I want to point this out because I think it's so interesting. Let's see. Yeah. This phrase, therefore God has joined together. Let not man put asunder. God cannot join together one of his people with the people of another God. God does not do that. That is porneia. God does not cause the members. I mean, again, I'm trying to still wrestle with this idea of Paul saying the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute, because it's not a direct one-to-one correlation here between Christ and someone from another nation per se, assuming, again, the Roman people, the way that their religion functioned was essentially this: whichever God is going to help me out, I am going to bring an offering to them. It was the exchange of your life to that God. So that could be what Porneia is referring to here. But what I want us to recognize, this idea, whoever shall divorce unless it is for porneia. I think what this means is similar to what we see happening in the book of Ezra. I don't know if you have taken a look at Ezra 10 recently, but let's just go there for a moment. I want you to see something that's taking place in the book of Ezra. This is a prophet. There's an issue that comes up here in the book of Ezra. There's, let's see. The people are many. What is happening? Among the sons of the priests, there were found that had taken strange wives. This is a problem. This is what porneia meant back in the book of Numbers. These people had married people who belonged to another god. They gave their hands that they would do what? Put away their wives. Jesus cannot answer this question by saying, if you put away your strange wife, you are committing adultery, because he would be condemning everything that happened here in the book of Ezra. He has to align with this. Whatever this is, putting away the wife who is a foreigner, who belongs to another god, who is a demonstration, a living demonstration of you being joined to another god. Think of Solomon with all of his wives. I think this is a good example of this concept in the Hebrew mind. Solomon committed porneia because he married all of these wives, and what happened? They turned his heart away from the Lord, which is ultimately the point and the reason why there's this prohibition, because you are supposed to be fully committed to this relationship with God. We're going to look a little bit more at that next week when we look at joined to and one flesh and what these mean throughout the scripture. In the book of Ezra, all these people are putting away their wives. Jesus is saying that is the one condition under which putting away a wife is not adultery, because under God, God did not join them together. So we're not separating anything that God has done. We are separating something that humans have done. We are undoing perhaps a sin that has been committed. We are undoing this thing that is shameful, that's not supposed to be done. It's not adultery. In fact, this is a good thing. That's what's happening in the book of Ezra. The book of Ezra is, it's a few hundred years before Christ, but this is going to be in recent memory. This is one of I think the book of Ezra and Nehemiah might be the last books in the Septuagint. These are going to be the things that are on people's minds. They had a different order for their biblical books than we do. So that's what we get in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 19. These rules about marriage to foreign women, which we see, again, this book of Numbers story is such an important reference point for us. That is ek pornuo. That is the worst kind of porneia. To bow down, to marry, to eat with the people who belong to another god because you're worshiping another god. Most people would rather be blind to this truth and go with their own personal convictions over scriptural evidence. Now, I want to challenge that a little bit, if I can, Blue, with this idea of the conscience and the way that God speaks to somebody. Because God can speak even through a misinterpretation of the scripture. Now, I think it's important for us all to be seeking a deeper understanding, but let's say I don't know. What do I have to follow? It is that guidance of conviction. Now, can we also be convicted in ways that are harmful for ourselves? Absolutely. So I think I can definitely see myself going both ways. But who would rather be blind than see the truth? I don't understand it. I want to go to the bottom of this. And when I began the study, I said, whatever I find is what I follow, because the scripture is a way in which I relate in intimacy with God. This is a way that I hear from God. And so I want to dive as deeply into understanding it as possible. Matthew 15:19. Here's another piece. For out of the heart, proceed. Where does porneia come from? Out of the heart. And it's next to evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornication. By the way, porneia often is next to things that we don't consider to be incredibly profound. Like today, we don't really think about things strangled and from blood and wickedness and covetousness. We're like, oh dear, like don't covet your neighbor's donkey kind of thing. When it sits next to murder, I'm like, oh dear, like this is serious now. And what Jesus is saying, both in Matthew 15 and Mark 19, is he's saying these things come out of the heart of the person. I think this is a really important thing for us to see. And when we take a look at the Mark passage, I wonder if it's the same in the book of Matthew, but I have a note on the Mark passage that the thing that is missing here, which is most often present, is the term idolatry. And idolatry is the strongest association with the word porneia. And so what I'm wondering here is if porneia in Matthew 15:19, and then again in our Mark passage, is being a stand-in for idolatry. Because you remember, what does porneia mean? If we look at the book of Numbers, it is the being joined to another god. Are we referring to a particular kind of sexual behavior? If he was saying this is πορνευω, the act of prostitution, maybe. But because it's porneia, we're kind of like referring to the concept of, say, Googling generally. We're referring to the concept of porneia generally as a noun. And what is it? What is the meaning attached to this? This is being joined to other nations, being joined to other gods. And because the word idolatry is missing from both of these lists, that's what makes me think that maybe porneia here is a stand-in for that term. By the way, if we look at the other things in the list, we have a number of things that belong in the Ten Commandments: theft, covetousness, murder, adultery. The other most important thing in the Ten Commandments is idolatry. Where do we see that? I think it's possibly here. Now, again, we have a whole lot of things in list, and lists don't tell us what the thing is. They just tell us, in this case, the list is saying porneia, that whatever porneia is, comes out of the heart of the person. The heart is going to be faithful to God, or the heart is going to sell itself to whatever it thinks is going to care for it. Is that a job? Is that a political party? Let's not practice porneia. It's idolatry. We have one God. Yep. Yeah. So continuing on, we've looked at Mark. We have the book of John. This is another interesting reference, and these are the only references. I don't think we saw. We did see some porne references in the Gospels, porne and then porneia, where John 8, Jesus is in conversation. I believe it's with the Pharisees. He says, "You do the deeds of your father." They said to him, "We were not born of porneia." Now, if we're reading this literally, again, we were not born from prostitutes. We're not bastard children, what they're saying. Then they would say, well, we know who our fathers are, right? Who is their father? We have one father, even God. Again, notice one father versus many fathers inherent in this idolatry porneia combination. And they read Jesus' statement as something theological. And they respond to him using the term porneia, recognizing that Jesus is going to understand they're not talking about who did your mommy sleep with. That's not what the question is. The question is entirely theological. Now, it's theological with the reference point, because if a prostitute did have a child, usually the father was unidentified. They didn't know who the father was. And so, like we talked about a little bit in language, things carry over from the original image into the actual meaning of the final term. Now we get to Acts chapter 15, which this one is going to be fun. If anyone looked at Acts 15, I hope you did. I hope you found it fascinating, especially because there's 3 times in the book of Acts where this rule is created. By the way, This is an apostolic rule that later Paul writes against. We saw this in, or will see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where Paul's like, eat whatever is set before you and don't ask whether it comes from the temple or not. Just don't give offense to anyone. That's what 1 Corinthians 10 ends up saying. So Paul doesn't see this as these are the new rules. This is the new definition of sin for Christians. That's not the way Paul treats this. I don't think it's the way we ought to treat it either. And if you are somebody who's gone through and you're like, ooh, fornication is still a rule because it's been mentioned here in Acts and it's a rule for Christians, you also need to recognize that eating anything with blood in it that has not been properly slaughtered and drained is on par with your premarital sex or extramarital sex or whatever it is you think fornication happens to mean. That still applies today. You need to be checking into how your animals have been killed before you eat them. And if you're a red meat lover, you are in deep trouble because blood is off the menu. Why were these things off the menu for early Christians? Why did all this stuff matter? we have a number of things that happen here in typical interpretation. People say, well, this is likely purity laws, and so they go back to Leviticus chapter 17 and 18. Leviticus 17 is where we get these rules about how animals need to be properly slaughtered. This is ritual purity. And then they are like, well, Leviticus 18 is right next to that, and Leviticus 18 includes all these examples of incest and other sexual things you're not supposed to do. So therefore, this must be the Jerusalem Council now saying, well, the book of Leviticus chapter 17 and chapter 18, which by the way includes one of our clobber passages, these now apply to all the Christians. We need to go back and we need to follow all of these sex rules and purity laws, or at least these ones that get mentioned. And by the way, anything to do with sex from those chapters, that falls under fornication. Because when the word again is not defined, we're like, well, this means everything it can possibly mean. Now, the problem is, again, if you do scholarly research, this is what you are going to find. This is the majority of saying, look, here's the New Testament. Early Christian leaders are now saying we need to do Leviticus 17 and 18. We need to be pure, holy temples of God. None of this extramarital sex stuff, none of this incest stuff. However, here's the problem with this. Zana, which is the Hebrew term for prostitution, is not part of the list in Leviticus 18. And when the Septuagint translates Leviticus 18, it doesn't use the word porneia to describe anything that's in there. And so when, again, this is what happens when you have a vague definition of a term, it leads to all kinds of mess, even scholarly mess, because people are trying to force porneia to fit Leviticus chapter 18 when it is just not there. So what could it be? Some people will be like, well, porneia means cultic prostitution, because again, they're back on this literal sexuality thing instead of seeing what is being done with this term in the Septuagint, talking about serving whatever God through your sexuality. So I think it's a little bit close, but it's historical speculation and it's unproved that what this means is participating in temple sex rituals. It could have been, but scholarship both on Corinth as well as on the early Canaanite peoples is showing that there wasn't all of these temple orgies. There wasn't all of this sexual worship of the gods that a lot of people like to imagine. And perhaps, as Gaka would write, perhaps the reason why those people were described in that way was to try to discredit them by saying, oh, these people have no control over their sexual appetite, which is what we see in Paul's discussions about honor and dishonor. So again, we're just looking at a couple of things that it doesn't mean. The thing that it could potentially be indicating is don't exploit prostitutes, don't eat pagan meat, don't violate Jewish table boundaries. I think that's okay up until the point where Paul says it's fine to eat pagan meat. Where is Paul getting this from? Is he now contradicting the Jerusalem Council? Go look at 1 Corinthians 10 if you want to. Actually, it might be 1 Corinthians 8 if you want to dive into this a little bit. We don't have time tonight to go all the way there. The argument that I will make about Acts 15 is this. I think that this whole thing, this cluster of 4 different rules, is a theological argument, because all 4 of these things would potentially happen in the worship of other gods. the food that you eat, the sex that you have, let it be done in a way that is not being joined to another God. Don't let your eating of food or your having of sex be something that identifies you with somebody that is not God, with another God. Essentially, don't exchange trade, commerce, don't exchange your honorable Christian identity for the sake of food or sex or whatever it might be. And secondly, because we have this mixing of the Jewish and Gentile communities, if we're going to be eating together, which is how we get joined together, we're going to have to avoid food that is strangled, because the Jews are going to have a really hard time with this. They're not going to be able to eat with you if you're having that. And from blood, because the life is in the blood. And if we go back, that's a whole nother study that's just absolutely fascinating to do throughout the Old Testament. All of these activities are ways that you could indicate or be joined to a pagan god. This is the meaning inherent within porneia. Don't be joined to a foreign god. You are already joined to one God. And furthermore, be kind to your neighbors, because don't violate the sensibilities of others, I have in my notes, which is how Paul ends 1 Corinthians chapter 10. He's like, whatever it is that you do it for God, not for the other gods. When we look at these things in this way now, okay, let's pause for a minute. Let's just pretend we've interpreted porneia here as premarital sex for the list of all the things that show up in Leviticus 18. We're going to have a huge problem because nobody applies the blood rule anymore. I bet you have never even thought about the strangled rule, unless you're in a Muslim culture or surrounded by people who keep kosher. Either one of those two. So how is it that somebody in the modern church can dismiss half of the rules, but then keep the premarital sex and extramarital sex notion and say, well, that's still important? You see how we run into contradictions when we don't take the time to understand what's being communicated by the text. The greatest of these is love. We're about to get to that. That's going to be in a couple more passages. So we've looked at Acts 15, Acts 21. Paul rewrites those rules, but really what he's concerned about, he's not concerned here, and the apostles here are also not concerned with sin. They're not saying avoid sin. They're saying do these things. We're going to ask the Gentiles to do these things, which are important, which we understand coming from a Hebrew context. This is important for them if we're going to all be in fellowship together. These are the things we're going to ask them to do. Paul adds a little bit more nuance again in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. We have one more major debunking to do, and that is 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1. We already looked at this a little bit. We have the commonly reported that there is porneia among you, and such porneia is not named among the Gentiles, that one should have his father's wife. When we look at this, a lot of people are like, oh, this is what porneia means. Porneia means incest. And they're like, Paul must be making reference again to Leviticus chapter 18. But as we already looked, Leviticus 18 does not include the word porneia, and all of the things that are listed in there are never described as porneia. Beautiful. Yes, we have a reference to Hebrews 12 about Esau, the exchanging of the birthright for food. This is exactly the notion that is inherent in porneia. And we'll get to that. We'll get to that verse in just a minute. In 1 Corinthians 5, though, when people are like, well, what does porneia mean? Here it's obvious. Paul is defining porneia as incest, except that never in any text anywhere is porneia linked with incest. This would be the only place in every Greek manuscript that we have where porneia was associated with incest. So Paul cannot be referring to Leviticus. Furthermore, when we look at this, not so much as is named among the Gentiles, his reference point is the Gentiles, not the Jewish scriptures. Quite interesting, right? So here's a couple of things that we need to talk about. Paul is leveraging the Greco-Roman honor-shame paradigm here. Again, he's saying you guys should be ashamed of yourselves. This is not honorable behavior, because in the Greco-Roman cultural standard, basically there were two things, if you remember from that list, that you couldn't do. You couldn't have sex with a woman who belonged to another man, whether that was his wife or whether that was a well-born daughter, and you couldn't commit incest. That was, in fact, incest was one of the only legally punishable things in the Roman laws. So one having his father's wife is not a violation of Leviticus per se. That's not what Paul is saying here. He's saying this is a violation of the Gentile honor shame code. This is worse than that. And we have this idea, again, let's remember, this is exchanging the honor of your body for sex, the honor for shame. And this kind of taking a father's wife was one of the most shameful things a person could do, because it is disrupting household hierarchy, paternal authority, was disrupting the maleness of the father, because now essentially the father's wife or concubine stands in for the father, and the father in this case is being penetrated by the son. That is unacceptable. But that is the imagery that's happening in the Roman variation of incest. Now you have people like Caligula and Nero who are accused of incest. But the reason why they're accused of it, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. They did some wild stuff. But the reason they're accused of it is it's a delegitimating strategy. Incest is tyrannical overreach. And Paul is saying even the pagans don't do this. Let's see. Yeah. The second thing that we're looking at, porneia is a metaphor for idolatry, right? Remember how porneia is used. And again, we're looking specifically at the term porneia, not pornuo, not pornos, not porne. And now we understand the nuance between these. Why is Paul using this term porneia? Why didn't he just say there is a problem happening here of incest, that one has his father's wife? This is terrible. Why does he label this porneia? And the reason I think he labels this as porneia is because he's viewing this as a betrayal of God, as an act of idolatry. Now, again, this is connected to my link between chapter 5 and 6. I've always been curious, why does Paul talk about chapter 5 is all about fornication, porneia? Chapter 6 then suddenly starts talking about legal matters. It just seems like there's this weird interruption at the beginning of chapter 6. He's like, what about lawsuits? And the interpretation, again, I'm probably pushing the limits of my credibility as a Bible scholar here by sharing this. I'm very early in my stages of studying this, but I think it's going to eventually, could potentially be a doctoral dissertation or something. But looking at 1 Corinthians 5 and Paul's example of porneia here as borrowing something from Nathan the prophet, who talks to David about a man who goes and steals a sheep. He's talking about a real story of a real person to get David all riled up, saying, no, this was unjust. This should not be done. I think this is Paul's rhetorical strategy here in opening 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And I think it could be said, if we're interpreting this in a theological way, that there is a man who has the wife of his father. Remember how God is the father? So somebody who has the wife of God would be exercising dominance over the Christian community. And when we get down to this thing of your glorying is not good, we realize that the Corinthians are celebrating this person. Nobody in their, like, who is going to be publicly celebrating somebody for having sex with their mom or their mother-in-law? It just doesn't make any sense. But if this is a metaphorical example of saying this kind of thing is completely unacceptable, now this is spiritually happening, there is a person who is taking dominance over the church. And when you look at the whole context of Paul's leading up to this, he's talking about different factions within the church, and one saying, I belong to this one, I belong to that one. And then Paul's trying to establish himself as the father of the church, who is the only one who has legitimate right to give the church as a bride away. So this is the whole context of the story. It's fascinating, but altogether what we need to see is that, again, Paul is using porneia in the same way that it shows up in the Septuagint, and porneia is never used to mean incest. I'm going to have to do a whole nother study on the term incest, because incest is addressed just never with this term porneia. Incest is not about a commercial exchange. That is a totally different issue. Porneia is about giving yourself over to another god through the way that you act, be that sexual, be that through food, be that otherwise. Let's see if we can go back to our list of porneia. Let's see. Yep. 5:1. You know what? We missed the one in Romans. There's another list over here. We might have time to take a look at a couple of lists, but I do have to keep moving. We are once again running out of time. Always happens. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 13, meat for the belly and the belly for meat. God will destroy both it and them. Now the body is not for porneia, but for what? Again, I want us to look at this. If we're seeing porneia as premarital sex, the body is not for premarital sex, but for marital sex. The body is not for anyone except for your married partner, right? But that's not what happens here. The purpose of the body is not for the husband or the wife in this passage. When we're talking about porneia here, we're talking about the body belonging to the Lord and the Lord belonging to the body. This is the idea of being created, being the image of God in creation. How can the image of God in creation be giving itself over to other gods? That would, of course, be porneia. Another comparison to the church body, we can also read this again as an individual or a corporate meeting. Then we get to the famous 6:18, flee fornication. We already looked at this and the connection to chapter 10:14, flee idolatry. We already looked at this idea of the singular versus plural in terms of the body. This could be a sin against the body of Christ. Now, here's the other thing. Just like the prophets were building on cultural expectations, so Paul is building on cultural expectations. I think it's okay for us to understand his arguments in terms of the cultural honor-shame dynamic. What I don't think is okay is to translate that cultural framework and value into our own day and say, well, this is now supported by Paul. I think this dynamic is used by Paul to explain something. I think he uses it because that's what his audience lives in. That's what they're going to understand. Does that mean now that God is saying, oh, this honor-shame dynamic where the dominant male is the one who gets to penetrate everything and he cannot sacrifice his honor by being penetrated? And by the way, you know, women and slaves and all these lower class people in society, that's the way God designed it. I have heard people make this argument, and I'm going to have to, in fact, probably address it directly at some point. I'm just pausing for a moment to point out that Paul is using something that's culturally familiar to his audience to explain the concept that he's trying to communicate. Nevertheless, here we have 7:2. Oh, 1 Corinthians 7:2 is so important because this became the primary way that people have interpreted this idea. 1 Corinthians 7:2, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife and let every woman have her own husband. The vernacular reading of this in English is let everyone get married before they have sex. That will help prevent premarital sex. Amazing. However, the actual phrasing of the verb to have, as well as the way that this passage is laid out, Paul is speaking to people who are already married. And these people are looking at the cultural phenomenon of abstinence and saying, hey, well, maybe we should just stop having sex with each other because we don't see a healthy expression of this in our culture. Remember, sex was all driven by eros. The New Testament reframes that, which we looked at that 2 weeks ago in our study of lust. So if there's no way to express sex in a healthy way, why maybe we should just not do it at all. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. And this, I have a fascinating article. It's written by Richard Hayes, where he explains this, that to let every man have means you guys who are married, keep having sex with each other. That is what this passage is saying. This passage is not unmarried people get married so you can have sex. But that is how, for some reason, that is the way that I heard this taught growing up. And look, let the husband render to the wife due benevolence, and likewise the wife to the husband. What is profound in Paul's teaching here? Well, again, maybe not quite so profound because we have this idea of due benevolence and this idea of defrauding. This is actually present in the Old Testament. where sexual satisfaction was an expectation of the marital relationship. What happens in chapter 7, which is incredible, can see this. It's a little bit further down, but he's talking about having, oh yeah, this one. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband. This was true in the entire Greco-Roman world. You know what was not true? The husband not having power over his own body. This was the complete opposite of honor. This was total dishonor. If a woman has power over your body, oh my gosh. Like, we have just violated this honor shame standard almost as terribly as we can. This is why I say we can't just translate that honor shame standard to our time and day. Another conversation for another time. Let's go back to our list. We have just a few more to get through, and I'm going to group some of these together because I want us to look at, let's see, Ephesians 5:3. We have porneia and all impurity and covetousness. We're going to have a list where porneia, akatharsia, uncleanness means this is what we looked at in our clean and unclean study. And the things that could make you unclean, by the way, were not who you had sex with. These were bodily fluids. So menstruation made you unclean, ejaculation made you unclean, and childbirth made you need to bring a sin offering to the tabernacle. And then covetousness. This word for covetousness is not epithumia. Again, if you want to see, you can open this up in the Blue Letter Bible, scroll down here to the word covetousness, and notice we have a different term coming in. So there are multiple Greek words that get translated as covetousness. And if you read further on in this passage, and then we look at these parallels, fornication, uncleanness, covetousness, we have a couple other things in here. Again, the explanation. This is idolatry. This is the most important of the 10 Commandments. Do not have any other gods before me. That, I think, is where we find porneia in the 10 Commandments. Do not have any other gods before me. Wow. I just realized that right now. That's really cool. Colossians 3:5. Put to death what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and pleonexia, which is idolatry. So the pairing, this particular word for covetousness means a desire for more. I want more. I am never satisfied. And this, in fact, there's so many cool things. When you look at the Hebrew word for zana, and that is the Hebrew word for prostitute, it comes from well-fed and never satisfied, wanting more. And so there is a connection now between porneia, covetousness, and idolatry. We look at 1 Thessalonians 4:3, and this idea that the will of God is your sanctification to abstain from what? Again, hopefully by now you don't think this means sex outside of marriage. You recognize this is the idea of possessing the body in holiness and in honor. Honor-shame dynamic. Again, keep this in the back of your mind. You'll see it everywhere in the New Testament, in Paul's writings. Let us behave with holiness and honor. You know what porneia is? The opposite of holiness and honor, the opposite of being set apart, the opposite of being honorable. And you can see this. God has not called us to uncleanness, but to holiness. And by the way, why does he say this is about a person defrauding his brother in this manner? That one's an interesting one. Think about that a little bit more if you want to. I have some notes on it, but we just don't have time. Revelation, let's move back to the book of Revelation. And here, I think we'll see something similar to what we saw with the word pορνευω. Again, so many references. Revelation really likes this term porneia. Why? Because the whole story of Revelation has to do with, are we serving one God or are we selling ourselves out to culture for economic power, for political influence? Are we getting into bed with the governments? That is really what is talking. The nations have drunk of this, the kings of the earth, the merchants of the earth. What is the church representing? What are the people of God representing to the world around them? Are they representing the interests of the nation state? Are they representing the interest of economics, of money? Who is it that they serve? The woman is arrayed in purple and scarlet color, royalty and wealth, decked with gold, precious stones, and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of porneia. This cup is some fascinating imagery if you want to study that. So one last thing I want to show to us here. Also, drunkenness being connected. This has to do with excess. So the term excess, we haven't really explored that. We touched on it just a tiny bit with covetousness, but there is in fact more of a connection there than we've had time to look at. So when I take a look at the book of Revelation, as well as 1 Corinthians 5 and 6, I think this is about a commercialization of the church. This is a warning against the church selling itself out to someone that has money, to someone that has power. That is in fact what is referred to by porneia. And when porneia is applied to a body of people as opposed to an individual body, this is the implication. Abraham's descendants are supposed to be a kingdom of priests, blessing the entire earth, not a group that's profiteering off of their connection with God. Finally, in prophetic imagery, the prostitute is always the bride. So we need to recognize that I think it's so interesting. The prostitute is always the bride. And by the way, Revelation is about, I was reading this in Gaka's book today, and my friend who teaches the course I talked about, Primeval Paradigms, which I highly will recommend, both of them have introduced me to this idea that the prostitute eventually becomes the bride. It is just like, it is one of the most profound stories of transformation. And if we can understand Porneia in that respect, as the one who sells herself to these others for the sake of whether it's money or political power, but is eventually redeemed. This is the story in the book of Hosea as well. This is the story we see, I think, in the book of Jeremiah. It's incredible, but we miss this whole piece when we're like, well, this is about sex outside of marriage and this person is sinning and we should try to avoid doing this until we have signed the papers. And I hope you have seen that the Bible doesn't really talk about that at all. It's just wild. This is the reason why when I first went looking for where does the Bible say premarital sex is a sin, I failed in my enterprise. I couldn't find it anywhere. Still can't. Because the emphasis of the writers of Scripture is not about that. Again, it's not about what you're doing. It is about the meaning of what you are doing. A couple of things I want to look at and just to wrap up and summarize some of these meanings. So two things that I take, two of the meanings, I wrote this down so I can share it. The individual meaning is to act with honor in ways that align with your identity as a child of God. Whether this is inside the bedroom, outside in the park, whether it's with your married partner or with anybody else that you meet. Don't sell yourself for desires for money, for sex, for power, but let yourself recognize that you have been sold to love. I think this is the contrast that we get in the New Testament teachings on porneia. I think we have a comment about that here. Lost its first love. Absolutely. Yes, a comment. I need to read this. It really brings light to the church in Revelation that lost its first love. Yeah, it lost the connection to love. Secondly, we have a similar meaning for the corporate body. The body is meant for the Lord, and the Lord for the body, not for public commerce. Remember, prostitution, the root of this, commercial exchange. Should we make the church as an institution about political activism? I think this is a really important question to ask. Partnership with Rome, that may be the symbol of being joined to the prostitute. Sometimes the prostitute meant Rome. I'm still wrestling with who the prostitute is there in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. It was a really interesting discussion. Desire for power, wealth, the oppression of the weak, the poor, the homeless, these are the things that symbolize Sodom and show that they had been sold out to ek pornuo, the worst kind of porneia. What was the sin of Sodom? It was economic, financial, relational. Fundamentally, I think it's a question of intimacy. All of this is who and what do you allow to grow in your life? What does your life display? If you are the image of God, what do people see when they look at you? Are you sold to desire? This idea of epithumia? Does your life and the things that you do, maybe your sexual expression, is that driven by lust? Or is it driven by what the authors present, this brotherly love, this agape love? Do you know how to do that? Do we even know how to look at this and recognize this? The other thing that I was thinking about today is just the story of Peter and how Peter gets out and he's walking on the waves. Do this eating, joining together in oh, yes, this is why I love the comments. Oh my goodness. Do this eating, joining together in remembrance or recollection of me, the body. Oh my goodness, not your body. The body of Christ. Oh my goodness. That is a beautiful connection. The communion, the Lord's Supper, the eating together, the being joined to one another. What a beautiful, intimate thing this is talking about. Absolutely. On the other hand, then what happens when we are joining ourselves to things like political parties, economic enterprises? What happens then? I said, what do people see when they notice a political bumper sticker instead of the image of God? Like I'm really pressing this point because the book of Revelation and this discussion of porneia, when it refers to the church, is all about the church selling itself out to some cultural dynamic, this exchange for wealth, this exchange for power. Who is going to meet my needs? Either we are going to show that it is God, or it is another ruler, a king of the earth, a great merchant. That is the choice that we get faced with. Porneia is an identity term with behavioral indicators. Porneia can be done in a way, or sex can be done in a way that shows porneia. You can either, your sexual expression is either one that showcases that you are doing this because you are a human being made in the image of God, or you are doing this because you are sold to something, be that desire or some other kind of standard that's imposed upon you by the church. And this is why I say that coerced celibacy is still a form of sexual coercion. We get to this kind of problematic conclusion when we fail to recognize what porneia means, when we try to impose our own meaning on it from 2,000 years later, instead of letting the text tell us what this is talking about. In fact, I will make the case that marriage for the sake of having sex is an example of porneia. This is the exact opposite of what people think that they're doing. This is a transaction through which a person accesses the sexuality of another person. If this is what we have turned marriage into, I think it's incredible. I was listening to a popular Christian teacher on the study of faith and sexuality the other day. And what they were talking about is the reason why people get married is to have sex. And the reason why we say sex is for marriage is so that people get married. What we are doing, we are turning sex into an exchangeable commodity instead of having it be a representation of intimacy, which we're going to dive into that concept more deeply on Tuesday. We have a couple more comments that I want to bring in here. Worldly powers, the anti-Christ, the opposite of Christ. What is it? What are we showing? Is it Christ or is it the opposite of? And then the body and blood are the church, not the elements of bread and wine. Wow. I'm going to have to think about that one over this next week. Thank you for that comment, because we're going to be talking about this when we look at the story of creation of man and woman. That is going to be something that comes into play. This idea particularly of flesh and blood. That's gonna be next week. Just one or two more things before we wrap up. First of all, I did a quick word study. If you want to see it, it's kind of cool. I'm going to post it on Substack. It shows the associations between porneia and other terms. There are 8 associations with idolatry, 6 with adultery, 3 with greed, 3 with impurity, and 2 with lasciviousness. And so what I'm trying to do and what I want to expand on a little further is see what are the associations that we get in the New Testament lists. Because right now the lists don't really tell us much of anything other than that porneia is something that we're not called to as people of God. In conclusion, let me pull this over. I want to read some of this. I think I had some beautiful ideas here. Let me see if I can get it onto my screen. I think that Paul is using the idea of porneia, and you'll see this especially, I did a study on Galatians chapter 5, where you can see this coming out quite clearly. Let me pull this over here. I want to see more comments. Yes, the Adam is also a body. The study I did of Galatians chapter 5 shows this idea clearly that we are either being slaves to desire or slaves to righteousness. The question is one of, are we sold to sin, sold to desire, or are we sold to Christ, sold to love? I think this is the contrast that we're called to consider in this term porneia. Do we sell ourselves to the bidding of our appetites and instinct, or do we remember this is why I hate reading stuff instead of ad-libbing. Let me come back. Do we sell ourselves to the bidding of our appetite and instinct, or do we remember that our bodies already belong to Christ? We don't get to sell them to the highest bidder. There is already one. Consider yourself married. We're going to look more into this parallel next week. To sell yourself to your desire is porneia and adultery. We are already sold to love. Porneia does have a sexual implication, and I will say this applies to everyone regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, because we are all driven by desire toward intimacy, toward this creative process. This is a symbol of sex. What is your life force going into? Intimacy will define our lives. The question that we have to answer is intimacy with what? From Blue, without Christ, we would all be slaves to sin. Intimacy with sin. Intimacy with what? Missing the mark. Are you familiar with falling short? Are you familiar with not measuring up? So what is it that we desire? Is our choice, are we going to direct our desire toward power, toward wealth, toward influence? Is it a desire to act out love in every expression of the body, whether it's the word we speak, the bodies we embrace, or the orgasms that we share? We can act out love in all of these things, or we can act out lust. This is what porneia is talking about. What is it? What is the meaning? Not who are you having sex with, not when are you having sex, not what kind of sexual positions. This is what is the meaning that you are creating through this act, as with every other act that you have in life. Sex is not set aside as some kind of litmus test, the ultimate sin, the biggest standard for Christians. That comes later. That's not what we see here in the New Testament. What we see is that it, like everything else, is a representation of who it is that we are worshiping, who it is that we are serving. So the question that remains is this: how do we learn to express and experience our sexuality in a way that represents the image of God in creation? I think for some people, this might look like being married first. For some people, this might look like a family. For some people, this looks like polyamory. For some people, this looks like attraction to people of the same gender. For pretty much every single person, it is going to look different. Porneia is a unifying question. It says, what are you allowing yourself to pursue and desire? Is it a pursuit of love? Is this an expression, an embodiment of Christ in the world? Or are you being sold to lust, sold to desire? I think Paul is trying to grab a whole new framework of life, not tell 21st century Christians which teachings from the book of Leviticus they still need to follow. This to me is so inspiring. This is the root of my work, is seeking to understand this. When I first started to see little pieces of this, this is what made its way into my book, Sacred, Not Sinful. This is what we're going to culminate with in the Bible study on Tuesday, looking at this concept of one flesh, Genesis 2:24. I hope by now you are no longer reading this as God's design for marriage or God's design for sex is that somebody gets married and has sex. That's not what those terms mean. We already looked at joined to. Marriage can be an example of that, and one flesh. Oh my goodness, I cannot wait for next week. So I hope you're excited to go into that, and that will wrap up our 10-week study on faith and sexuality. If you've been here the whole time, thank you so much for joining me on these deep dives. We have gone a lot deeper and a lot more dense than I expected. I was going to try to keep this a little bit at surface level, but I hope this has been meaningful to you. I'm going to package all of these up. I'm uploading them in 4K so that you can see the text on the screen so that everything comes through clearly. So if you're ever watching through one of the videos that's a live stream and it's not coming through, just send me a message. I will connect you with the updated version. Well, I think that's about it. Thank you again, all of you who participated and contributed to this conversation tonight. I hope you'll be able to join me on Tuesday. And until then, love to you all.